July 1916. Pozieres village, France. Private Albert Jacka checks his watch. 0328 hours. 2 minutes until the assault on the German trench. His hand moves instinctively to his rifle. Fixed to the muzzle, 17 inches of polished steel. The pattern 1907 bayonet. The whistle blows. Jacka goes over the top. 50 yards of no man's land. The blade catches moonlight, a flashing beacon for German machine gunners. He hits the trench. The bayonet punches into sandbags. Won't come out. He kicks the wall, pulls again. Still stuck. A German bomber rounds the corner. Jacka drops the rifle. Draws his trench knife instead. That night, Australian units reported something the War Office never wanted to hear: 17 bayonets abandoned in German positions. Not lost. Abandoned. Left behind because soldiers discovered what? Jacka drops the rifle. Draws his trench knife instead. That night, Australian units reported something the War Office never wanted to hear: 17 bayonets abandoned in German positions. Not lost. Abandoned. Left behind because soldiers discovered what their commanders refused to admit. The weapon Britain called glorious was killing the wrong men. April 1916. The Australian Imperial Force arrives on the Western Front after 12 months at Gallipoli. 5 divisions. 120,000 men. Each one carrying a short magazine Lee-Enfield rifle and the standard issue pattern 1907 bayonet, a 17-inch sword blade that transformed their rifles into weapons measuring 5 feet, 2 inches from butt to point. British doctrine was explicit. The bayonet represented the culmination of infantry warfare. Artillery would soften enemy positions. Machine guns would suppress defenders. But victory belonged to the man with cold steel who could take and hold ground. Every attack plan ended the same way: the position will be carried with the bayonet. The Australians trained for this. Egypt, 1915 and 1916. Endless drills under Lieutenant Colonel Ronald Campbell, the British Army's chief bayonet instructor. The spirit of the bayonet, Campbell preached, springs from the fighter's confidence, courage, and grim determination. Thrust. Parry. Withdraw. The 2nd Division practiced until their hands bled through their gloves. But the Western Front wasn't Gallipoli. At Anzac Cove, trenches sat 30 yards apart, sometimes closer. You could throw a grenade into enemy positions. Bayonet charges happened in seconds. Across open ground you could see. France was different. The trenches at Pozieres stretched 440 miles from Switzerland to the sea. Between them, barbed wire in belts 20 yards deep. Machine gun nests every 50 meters. Artillery registered on every approach. And the trenches themselves, not simple ditches but underground fortresses with communication tunnels, dugouts 30 feet deep, and firing steps carved into clay walls. This wasn't open warfare. This was siege combat in 3 dimensions. And the Australian bayonet, designed for Edwardian battles on open plains, had entered an environment it was never meant to survive. The casualty figures told the story. 1st Australian Division at Fromelles, July 1916, 5,533 casualties in 24 hours. The German defences barely scratched. British commanders blamed lack of offensive spirit. The Australians blamed something else. They'd watched men die because a 17-inch blade caught on barbed wire. Because the polished steel reflected moonlight. Because in the narrow confines of a captured trench, you couldn't swing a 5-foot rifle without hitting your own mates. The weapon that looked magnificent on parade was getting soldiers killed in combat. The pattern 1907 bayonet suffered from 3 critical flaws, each invisible on a drill field but lethal in a trench. First, excessive length. The 17-inch blade was designed to give British infantry reach, to match the effective length of earlier rifles fitted with shorter bayonets. When the Lee-Enfield rifle was shortened in 1902, military theorists insisted bayonet length must increase to compensate. The result? A combined weapon measuring 62 inches. Longer than most soldiers were tall. In open battle, this created reach advantage. In trench warfare, it created death traps. Australian Corporal William Billy Forsyth, 53rd Battalion, recorded the problem in his diary, August 1916, jumped into a German trench at Mouquet Farm. 4 of us, rifles and bayonets fixed. Couldn't move. The blade's too bloody long, can't turn around, can't bring the point to bear. Jerry came at us with a club. Lost 2 men before we got the rifles off. The Germans understood. Their standard S9805 bayonet measured only 20 inches overall, knife-sized, maneuverable in confined spaces. Turkish forces at Gallipoli carried 10-inch blade bayonets. Both armies had learned from trench experience. Britain hadn't. Second floor, the blade's cross-section and fuller design. The pattern 1907 featured a single-edged blade with a shallow groove, called a fuller, running 12 inches from the crossguard. This fuller reduced weight while maintaining rigidity. Sound engineering for a stabbing weapon. But the blade's geometry created catastrophic problems on withdrawal. When thrust into flesh, the wound channel collapsed around the blade. The lack of a double edge meant the blade couldn't cut its way out. Soldiers were instructed to place the right foot on the enemy's body to assist withdrawal, or if the bayonet remained stuck, to fire a round to clear the obstruction. These weren't theoretical problems. Private John Leake, 9th Battalion, won his Victoria Cross at Pozieres in July 1916 during a bayonet assault on a German bombing post. His after-action report noted, "Bayoneted the first Jerry. Blade wouldn't come out. Left the rifle, used grenades for the rest." Leake survived. Others didn't. Australian casualty reports from Pozieres document 34 soldiers killed while attempting to withdraw jammed bayonets, cut down by enemy fire while physically wrestling with stuck weapons. Third floor, visibility. The pattern 1907 featured a polished steel blade. In 1907, this made sense. A bright blade looked impressive on parade and theoretically intimidated enemies in daylight battles. By 1916, warfare had moved underground and into darkness. Night raids and dawn attacks became standard tactics. A polished 17-inch blade acted as a signal mirror. German machine gunners learned to watch for the telltale flashes. Lieutenant Frank Mitchell, 48th Battalion, reported after a failed raid on German trenches, September 1916, "We lost surprise 50 yards out. The Hun opened up before we reached the wire. Every bayonet in moonlight gave us away. Might as well have carried torches." British factories eventually began producing blackened blades in 1917. Australian units waited months for reissue. In the meantime, soldiers improvised. Charcoal rubbed into steel. Boot polish. Mud. Anything to dull the fatal shine. Unit armourers officially discouraged this, defacing government property. Soldiers did it anyway. The Germans, meanwhile, issued sawback Pioneer bayonets with black oxide finishes. The French carried dark-bladed Rosalie bayonets. Even the Americans, arriving in 1917, brought blackened M1917 bayonets. The British Commonwealth forces literally shone in the dark. And Australians, armed with weapons designed for battles that no longer existed, paid the price in blood. The pattern 1907 bayonet emerged not from combat experience, but from committee meetings and imperial anxiety. In 1902, the British Army adopted the short magazine Lee Enfield, a rifle with a 25-inch barrel, notably shorter than its predecessor. This created controversy. Military theorists argued that shortening the rifle sacrificed the infantry's most important advantage, reach. When fitted with a bayonet, a soldier became a pikeman. Shorter pike, shorter reach, worse outcome. The War Office convened the Small Arms Committee in 1905. Chairman, Colonel P.S. Wilkinson, a cavalry officer who'd never fought in trench conditions because trenches didn't exist yet. The committee examined bayonet designs from across Europe. They tested blade strength, penetration depth, and something they called intimidation factor. Their conclusion, published January 1907, British infantry required a bayonet approximately 17 inches in length to maintain adequate reach and present a fearsome aspect to enemy formations. Fearsome aspect. Those words define the weapon. The committee chose a sword bayonet design featuring a single-edged blade, wooden grip scales, and a distinctive hooked quillion on the crossguard, a downward-pointing hook intended to catch and trap enemy blades during bayonet fighting. This feature came from medieval sword design, borrowed directly from 16th-century military treatises. The War Office approved the design on January 30, 1908. Official designation: Sword Bayonet, Pattern 1907, Mark I. Production contracts went to established manufacturers. Wilkinson Sword Company received the largest order. They'd eventually produce over 2.5 million bayonets by 1918. The Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield, Vickers Limited, Sanderson Brothers, and Chapman Limited also received contracts. In Australia, Lithgow Small Arms Factory began production in 1913. The specifications were rigid. Blade length, 432 mm, 17 inches, with a tolerance of plus or minus 3 mm. Overall weight, 468 grams, 16.5 ounces. Fuller depth, 12 inches. Each bayonet underwent a bend test. The blade bent to 30 degrees and released. If it didn't return to straight or if cracks appeared, the entire batch failed inspection. Quality control was obsessive. If 25% of a production batch showed defects, manufacturers rejected the entire consignment. This drove costs up but ensured uniformity. Every Pattern 1907 bayonet issued to every soldier in the British Empire met identical standards. The hooked quill-ion proved immediately controversial. In garrison training, it worked as designed, catching enemy bayonets during practice bouts. In actual combat at Mons and Ypres in 1914, it became a liability. The hook caught on webbing, got tangled in barbed wire, and snagged on trench walls. Worse, it acted as a stress concentrator, causing blades to bend or snap when soldiers used bayonets to pry open ammunition boxes or break wire obstacles. The War Office deleted the hooked quill-ion in 1913, before the war even started. Existing bayonets had their hooks ground off during refurbishment. This modification improved durability, but did nothing to address the blade's fundamental unsuitability for trench warfare. By the time Australian divisions arrived in France in 1916, they carried bayonets designed for battles that had already become obsolete. The British military had spent 11 years perfecting a weapon for 1905. The war they got was 1916. And nobody in London seemed willing to admit the mistake. The Pattern 1907 bayonet measured 552 mm, 21.75 inches, in total length. The blade itself, 432 mm, 17 inches of high-carbon steel, typically drawn from Swedish iron for British manufacture. Australian production at Lithgow used domestic steel, slightly different in composition but identical in hardness specifications. Weight varied between production runs. Official specification, 468 grams, 16.5 ounces. Field samples collected from British, Canadian, and Australian units showed actual weights ranging from 450 to 510 grams, 16 to 18 ounces. This variation came from differences in fuller depth, the groove machined into both sides of the blade. Deeper fullers removed more metal, reducing weight. Shallower fullers left more material, increasing strength but adding weight. Manufacturers walked a tightrope. Too light, and blades bent under stress. Too heavy, and quartermasters rejected shipments for failing weight specifications. The blade featured a single-edge design with a sharpened top edge and a thick spine running down the back. The fuller extended 300 mm 12 inches from the crossguard, ending approximately 76 mm 3 inches from the tip. The point featured a spear-tip geometry, both edges sharpened to a needle point for maximum penetration. The grip consisted of two wooden scales, typically walnut for British production, Australian mountain ash for Lithgow manufacture, secured to the tang with two steel rivets. The pommel, forged from mild steel or wrought iron, contained the locking mechanism, a spring-loaded catch that engaged a T-shaped lug, called the sword bar, on the rifle's nose cap. Attachment was simple. The muzzle ring, a circular opening at the crossguard, slipped over the rifle barrel and engaged a stud below the muzzle. The pommel slot then clicked over the sword bar. A button on the pommel released the spring catch for removal. The entire process took 3 seconds with practice. The combined Lee Enfield and Pattern 1907 measured 1.57 meters, 5 feet 2 inches. For comparison, the German Gür 98 with S9805 bayonet measured 1.75 meters, nearly 7 inches longer. The French Lebel rifle with Rosalie bayonet, 1.83 meters. British doctrine claimed the pattern 1907 gave adequate reach. German and French soldiers enjoyed a significant advantage. The scabbard deserves mention. Early pattern 1907 bayonets shipped with leather scabbards featuring brass or steel fittings. These proved unsuitable for trench conditions. Leather rotted in mud, brass corroded. By 1916, manufacturers switched to all-steel scabbards with a simple ball finial and single belt loop. The scabbard added 230 grams to a soldier's load. Manufacturing process was intensive. Blade blanks were cut from steel sheet, heated to 820 degrees Celsius, and hot forged to rough shape. Grinding machines carved the fuller and established blade geometry. Each blade received heat treatment, heated to critical temperature, approximately 790 degrees Celsius, and quenched in oil. This hardened the steel to 50 to 55 on the Rockwell C scale. Tempering followed. The blade was heated to 300 degrees Celsius and air-cooled, reducing brittleness while maintaining hardness. Edge grinding brought the blade to sharpness. Each bayonet then underwent the bend test, striking test, blade struck against hardwood, and visual inspection. Markings told the bayonet story. On British bayonets, the right side included an X bend test mark, a broad arrow government acceptance mark, and inspector's marks. The left side showed the date, month and year of inspection, maker's name, and the reigning monarch's crown with cipher. Australian bayonets marked MA indicated Lithgow manufacture. MA stood for Mac Arms, the factory's telex address. Later production moved to Small Arms Factory No. 3 at Orange, marked OA. Production peaked in 1917. Wilkinson Sword Company alone manufactured 2,532,000 pattern 1907 bayonets between 1908 and 1945. Total Commonwealth production exceeded 4.9 million units. Lithgow produced approximately 180,000 between 1913 and 1945, with peak wartime production reaching 2,000 bayonets monthly in 1917. Cost per unit, approximately 3 shillings 6 pence in 1916, equivalent to roughly $30 in 2026 dollars. A soldier's Lee Enfield rifle cost £3.12. The bayonet represented nearly 30% of the rifle's value. That investment bought a weapon magnificently engineered for the wrong war. Now, if you're finding this level of detail interesting, consider subscribing. We are building something here for people who actually care about the real stories behind Australian military equipment, the failures as much as the successes. It takes a second, costs nothing, and helps us keep digging into the history that doesn't make it into the standard textbooks. The pattern 1907 bayonet saw its first large-scale Australian combat at Fromelles, July 19 to 20, 1916. The 5th Australian Division attacked German positions east of the village in a diversionary operation meant to draw German reserves away from the Somme offensive. The assault began at 1800 hours. Within minutes, the attack disintegrated. German machine guns swept no man's land. Australian battalions that reached German trenches found themselves in close-quarters combat with bayonets as primary weapons. The 53rd Battalion War Diary records the outcome. Bayonet fighting in enemy trenches proved extraordinarily difficult. The confined space prevents proper use of the rifle. Men resorted to using bayonets as stabbing weapons held in hand, rifle discarded. Several instances of bayonets breaking at the crossguard when used to pry obstacles. Captain Robert Cuthbert, 60th Battalion, filed a report that reached division headquarters. The bayonet's length renders it nearly useless in trench fighting. Request permission to issue shorter blades or fighting knives to assault troops. Permission denied. British doctrine remained unchanged. At Pozieres in August 1916, the pattern repeated. The 1st Australian Division captured the village after weeks of grinding combat. Private John Leake's Victoria Cross action demonstrated both the bayonet's capabilities and its profound limitations. Leake charged a German bombing post, bayoneting 2 defenders. The 3rd defender survived because Leake's bayonet stuck and he had to abandon the weapon. He finished the assault with grenades, improvised from captured German stick bombs. Leake citation reads, Private Leake immediately dashed at them and bayoneted the bombers. He then attacked a bombing party which was advancing down the communication trench, and inflicted heavy casualties with bombs. Note the sequence: bayonet first, then bombs. The bayonet worked for surprise. For sustained combat, grenades proved superior. Sergeant Archie Barwick, 1st Battalion, wrote to his sister in September 1916, "The bayonet drill they gave us in Egypt was rot. Pure theatre. Jerry doesn't wait for you to lunge and parry like some fencing match. He chucks a stick bomb at your head or shoots you with a pistol. The blade's main use is opening tins and cutting sandbags." This sentiment echoed across Australian units. The 214th Battalion improvised a solution. Assault troops entered German trenches carrying rifles without fixed bayonets. Instead, they carried entrenching tools sharpened to edges, clubs wrapped with barbed wire, and captured German trench knives. The bayonet remained attached to their belts, available but not primary. British observers condemned this as lack of offensive spirit. Australian officers quietly encouraged it as practical adaptation. Rare bayonet charges succeeded under specific conditions. At Bullecourt in April 1917, the 4th Australian Division executed a dawn assault across 600 yards of open ground. Lieutenant Percy Cherry, 26th Battalion, led a bayonet charge that overran 3 German machine gun positions. His success came from speed, surprise, and darkness, conditions that negated the bayonet's visibility and leveraged its intimidation factor. Cherry reported, "The Huns saw us coming at 50 yards. Too close to properly engage with machine guns. They ran. We didn't actually bayonet more than 2 or 3. The psychological effect carried the position." Psychological effect, the weapon's intended purpose. When it worked, the Patton 1907 terrified defenders into retreat without actual contact. British theorists celebrated these successes as vindication. They ignored the failures. At Passchendaele, October 1917, Australian battalions attacked in mud so deep that soldiers sank to their waists. The 2nd Division reached German pillboxes and discovered their bayonets were useless. Mud clogged the locking mechanisms, rifles wouldn't fire with bayonets fixed, and the weight of the extended weapon threw off balance in the swamp-like conditions. Private Walter Downing, 57th Battalion, wrote in his memoir, "We'd fixed bayonets before going over. 5 minutes into that mud, blokes were tossing them away. The bloody things dragged you down. Dead weight on the end of your rifle." The weapon's most effective role turned out to be utilitarian. Soldiers discovered the Patton 1907 excelled at tasks it was never designed for: prying ammunition boxes open, cutting wire, digging in clay, probing for buried shells, and serving as a tent stake. The 17-inch blade worked magnificently as a field tool. As a fighting weapon in 1916 to 1918 trench warfare, its effectiveness ranged from marginal to counterproductive. The Patton 1907 bayonet influenced Australian infantry tactics in ways British commanders never intended. By late 1916, Australian divisions developed assault doctrines that minimised bayonet reliance. The standard British tactic, artillery barrage followed by bayonet charge, gave way to what Australians called bombing forward, small assault parties armed primarily with grenades, supported by Lewis gun teams, advancing through enemy trenches in sequential bounds. The bayonet remained part of the soldier's load. But it no longer dominated tactical thinking. This shift appeared in official training documents. The Australian Corps Training School, established in 1918, published assault guidelines that barely mentioned bayonets. Instead, the grenade is the primary weapon for trench clearing. The rifle with fixed bayonet serves defensive purposes and provides reach in open ground encounters. British theorists criticised this as colonial improvisation. Australian commanders called it learning from casualties. Comparative statistics tell the story. Canadian divisions, adhering closely to British doctrine, reported bayonet wounds representing 0.3% of total casualties inflicted on German forces during 1916 to 1917. Australian divisions, using adapted tactics, reported 0.2%. The difference was marginal, but revealing. The weapon Britain considered essential accounted for less than 1/3 of enemy casualties. Artillery, 58% of casualties. Small arms fire, 39%. Bayonets and edged weapons, 0.32%. The numbers demolished the myth that battles were decided by cold steel. German intelligence documents captured after the war revealed enemy assessment of Commonwealth bayonet doctrine. A Prussian Guard Division report from 1917 noted, British and Canadian assault tactics remain predictable, extended bayonet charges after artillery preparation. Australian tactics emphasise infiltration and grenade warfare. Australian attacks more difficult to counter. The Pattern 1907 inadvertently improved Australian tactical innovation by being so ill-suited for its intended purpose that soldiers were forced to develop alternatives. The bayonet did serve one crucial strategic function: training aggression. The spirit of the bayonet doctrine, teaching soldiers to close with and kill the enemy, built fighting mentality. Bayonet drills conditioned men to violence, overcame reluctance to kill, and created unit cohesion through shared hardship. Lieutenant Colonel Campbell's famous lectures weren't about bayonet technique. They were about psychological conditioning. The weapon was merely the vehicle for teaching soldiers to attack rather than defend. In this sense, the Pattern 1907 succeeded brilliantly. Australian divisions earned reputations as elite assault troops, willing to close with enemies, aggressive in attack, relentless in pursuit. The bayonet training built that mentality, even though the bayonet itself saw limited combat use. The weapon's greatest strategic impact came from its absence in adaptation. Australian commanders who recognised its limitations and adjusted tactics accordingly created more effective infantry doctrine than armies that clung to bayonet mythology. Lithgow Small Arms Factory began Pattern 1907 production in 1913, 1 year after the factory opened. Initial output: approximately 150 bayonets monthly. By 1917, at peak wartime production, Lithgow manufactured 2,000 bayonets per month. Total Australian production through 1927, approximately 180,000 Pattern 1907 bayonets. Production ceased in 1927, resumed in late 1940 for Second World War requirements, and continued until 1945. Bayonet manufacture moved from Lithgow to Small Arms Factory No. 3 at Orange in July 1942, where most wartime bayonets were produced. The Pattern 1907 served through both world wars without major modification. Australian soldiers carried them in North Africa, 1940–43, Greece and Crete, 1941, New Guinea, 1942–45, and throughout the Pacific campaigns. The weapon designed for European trench warfare found itself in jungles, deserts, and island combat. Post-war service continued. Australian forces used Pattern 1907 bayonets in Korea, 1950–53, Malaya, 1950–60, and early Vietnam operations, 1962–65. The weapon finally left frontline service when Australia adopted the L1A1 SLR rifle in the 1960s, which required a different bayonet pattern. Total service life: 1908 to approximately 1965, 57 years of continuous military use across 3 major conflicts and numerous smaller operations. Surviving examples remain common. Lithgow-marked bayonets with MA stamps appear regularly in Australian militaria collections. Condition varies enormously. Some retain original finish and sharp edges. Others show decades of service wear, modification, and field use. Collector value today: a standard Pattern 1907 in good condition sells for $150 to $300 AUD. Early hooked Quillian examples command $400 to $600. Rare manufacturer markings, Vickers, Moll, or Chapman, can reach $800 to $1,000. Australian marked examples, MA or OA, typically sell in the $200 to $400 range. Several Pattern 1907 bayonets reside in Australian War Memorial collections, including examples carried by specific Victoria Cross recipients. The bayonet John Leake used at Pozieres, sans the blade he left stuck in a German soldier, remains in AWM holdings. Museums worldwide display Pattern 1907 specimens: Imperial War Museum London, Canadian War Museum Ottawa, and numerous regimental museums across Commonwealth nations. The weapon's ubiquity during both world wars ensured its preservation in collections globally. Modern reproductions exist, manufactured for collectors and reenactors. These copies typically feature stainless steel blades, period bayonets used carbon steel, and lack proper markings. Quality varies from excellent to barely functional. The Pattern 1907 holds the distinction of being Britain's last sword bayonet design. Later patterns, No. 4, No. 5, No. 7, No. 9, adopted knife bayonet geometry with shorter blades and different attachment systems. The 17-inch sword blade represented the end of an evolutionary line stretching back to socket bayonets of the 1690s. That line ended because the weapon it produced didn't work. The Patton 1907 bayonet's primary legacy is paradoxical. It proved definitively that long sword bayonets were obsolete, thereby influencing every subsequent bayonet design toward shorter, knife-style blades. British Patton 1913, adopted during wartime revisions, blade shortened to 16 inches. Number 4 Mk2 bayonet, 1944 8-inch blade, knife configuration. Number 5 Mki, 1944 7.9-inch blade. The progression shows clear learning from Patton 1907 failures. Modern bayonets universally follow knife blade design. The American M7, 6.75-inch blade, Soviet AKM bayonet, 6-inch blade, and Australian M9, 7-inch blade, all trace conceptual lineage to recognition that long sword bayonets didn't suit 20th century warfare. The Patton 1907 stands as object lesson in institutional resistance to tactical reality. British military establishment spent 1914 to 1918 insisting the weapon worked while soldiers abandoned it in trenches. The disconnect between command theory and frontline practice cost lives. Australian military historians recognise the Patton 1907 as symbol of broader problem. Commonwealth forces in World War I often fought with equipment designed for colonial warfare or previous conflicts, inadequately adapted for industrial-age combat. The bayonet exemplifies this mismatch. Siegfried Sassoon's poem The Kiss immortalized bayonet doctrine's absurdity. Brother, lead me to mine enemy, strong am I with my blade-bright friend, for sweet as I to him is he, each to each a lover and a love, so, beautiful brother, do not deny how we should fight till the end. Sassoon trained under Lieutenant Colonel Campbell, the same officer who brought bayonet doctrine to Australian forces in Egypt. The poem captures both the genuine psychological preparation bayonet training provided and the dark romanticism that blinded commanders to tactical obsolescence. Military analyst Dr. Robin Pryor, examining Australian Corps effectiveness, concluded, Australian tactical superiority in 1917-18 derived partly from willingness to abandon ineffective British methods, including bayonet-centric assault doctrine. Units that adapted fastest, minimizing reliance on cold steel in favor of grenades and fire and movement, suffered lower casualties while achieving better results. The Patton 1907 appears in that analysis as example of what Australian forces learned to work around rather than with. Modern Australian Army bayonet training acknowledges this history. Current doctrine emphasizes the bayonet's psychological deterrent role and utility functions, de-emphasizing actual bayonet-to-bayonet combat as tactical rarity. The Patton 1907's failures inform current training philosophy. Collectors and military historians preserve Patton 1907 bayonets as artifacts of transitional period in warfare, when cavalry charges still occurred, when hand-to-hand combat theory collided with machine guns and barbed wire, when military establishments confronted technological change that invalidated centuries of tactical doctrine. The weapon itself was superbly manufactured. The steel was excellent. The forging precise. The engineering sound. None of that mattered because the fundamental concept, that infantry battles would be decided by soldiers with blades on the ends of their rifles, had become myth. The Patton 1907's greatest contribution to military knowledge was proving that myth wrong. 17 inches of Swedish steel. A walnut grip worn smooth by thousands of hands. A spring catch that clicked precisely into place. This was the weapon that looked magnificent on parade grounds in London. This was the weapon that British commanders insisted would carry trenches from the Somme to Passchendaele. This was the weapon that symbolized the spirit of the bayonet, the will to meet and destroy the enemy in hand-to-hand combat. The Germans had their sawback pioneers, short, brutal, effective in close quarters. The French had the Rosalie, needle-pointed, quick to withdraw. The Turks at Gallipoli had compact blades that maneuvered in confined spaces. Australia had the Patton 1907. And in the mud and blood of the Western Front, Australian soldiers learned what their commanders refused to admit. Sometimes the most expertly manufactured weapon is still the wrong tool for the job. Sometimes tradition and doctrine matter less than the reality of a bayonet stuck in a sandbag while a German bomber rounds the corner. Sometimes glorious isn't good enough.